I would first like to thank the Majors Committee for having selected me to give this presentation. Given that it is a topic I'm so engaged in, other than the crowd, I love to talk about my subjects, so bear with me. I decided after hearing Professor Qualls give a lecture last spring, right? He came and talked about the book that he had published, that I would sort of follow the same model that he offered, but instead of a finished book, which I might wish this were, I'm going to talk about a book in progress, right? I'm in the middle of the project, and what I want to do is talk a bit about where the project came from and why I'm doing it and what I hope to accomplish, all right? So let me start with the question of where I came up with the topic initially. And it takes me back to working on my first book, which had to do with World War I in France. And one of the things that I looked at were musical reviews. And I was sitting in particular archives in Paris reading musical reviews, not getting to listen to them, from the war. And I came across one in which Napoleon appeared. Right? So he appeared as a character on stage. And it was very interesting to read his character because it's in the middle of a war, a massive undertaking, and he is up there chiding the population to give it their all, being quite funny. And so there's a certain personality that came across. Then later when I was reading newspapers, again from World War I, I came across a set of letters that Napoleon had sent to the newspaper. Right? So these were sort of weekly letters that Napoleon apparently was writing. And again, this sort of use of Napoleon as a figure with a lot of familiarity. One of the things that struck me was here was this sort of heroic figure, a national icon, who had a lot of personality in these representations and invited people to feel familiar to him. At that point, I was working on another project, so I put this on the back burner. Then later, I was working on a project having to do with the streets of Paris during World War I. And in the process of that, I was back in the archives in Paris, this time in the police archives. And I was looking at material from the streets in the period before World War I, so in the period 1870 to 1914. All right, and I want to show you a couple things that I came across as I was digging through the archives. Now, first of all, I wanted to show you, so here is, typical cartons in the police archives. These are two that I actually worked a lot on, and you get to sort of see any one carton, right, has a lot of things stuffed in there, and you don't know quite what you're going to find. They had cartons dedicated to Joan of Arc, which surprised me. And I started to go through them, looking at things having to do with the streets of Paris. And along the way, I found some really interesting objects. So this was a document that someone had written, right, out by hand on a long sheet of paper. It's addressed to the nation, I think if you can tell that. And what they had done was that they had posted it on a door as close to a statue of Joan of Arc as they could get, right in the middle of Paris. And I was just fascinated that it was in the police archives, and I was also very interested in the fact of where they put it and why they put it there. And as I continued to dig, I came across sort of some ideas of why they did it that way. Now, I also found other things, objects in the archives, in these same cartons. So this is from the same period, pre-World War I, and it says Fête Nationale de Jeanne d'Arc. So this is in a period when there was a campaign to get a national holiday for Joan of Arc. But this was a somewhat controversial proposition, which will become clear why as I go forward. Another object I found in some of the same boxes, this is sort of it's a boutonniere, all right? So you can sort of, it's not this big. You have to sort of imagine it smaller. So it's sort of wrapped up here, and it had a pin, and it has the N for Napoleon, right? Purple, which was one of his colors. And one thing that I realized from reading the attachment, which comes from a police report, is that this was a subversive object, right? That this is in the period after Napoleon III has fallen, who was Napoleon I's nephew. So the Napoleons are out of favor. The government is very worried about Bonapartists and whether they will return and somehow be a political problem. So to wear this was to indicate where your allegiance was, and it was to risk running into the police. Okay, and that's how it gets into the archives, because the police are collecting these things because they're worried about the political dissent that is out in the streets of Paris. Now, as I went through the documents on the streets, I was really struck by how politics played out in the public sphere and how important these two figures were, right? Napoleon and Joan. In this case, this is the Place Vendôme in Paris, and this is the large column that sits in the center. This was originally put up by Napoleon himself, and it was dedicated to his victory at Austerlitz, which was one of his biggest military victories. And at the top is Napoleon himself, right? And I'll sort of come back to the fact that this sits in a prominent place in Paris. But here he is dressed as a Roman, right? His choice in terms of how to represent himself. Now, it wasn't just the fact that this was here and that pro-Bonapartists would march to this site. What really struck me was how controversial this became. So in the 1830s, right, so the original was put up while Napoleon was still ruling, before 1815. In the 1830s, they took down the statue of him as a Roman, and they put up a statue of him as a common soldier, right? They had a nickname for him as sort of the little corporal. And this is under Louis Philippe, who is another monarch, who is trying to sort of attach himself to the Napoleonic legacy. So they take one down, they put another up. Then in 1863, with Napoleon III, he takes that one down and puts a copy of the original back up. All right? Then in 1871, the Commune comes in, a very leftist revolutionary government, and they take the whole thing down. And they do it with this huge celebration, right, where everybody comes out. They announce it ahead of time. They're all excited. And this is very much anti-Napoleonic. They tear it down. And here is poor Napoleon on the ground, right, shattered. And that didn't seem to be, that was something to cheer for this particular group. Not surprisingly, 1875 comes along, and Napoleon is back up on his column. All right? So one thing was that this was very political, and that they didn't hesitate to change the statue, right? That wasn't a problem to knock it down and put something else up. All right? Now, in Joan's case, I discovered that statues were also very important for her. Now, she did not have a hand in getting a chance to choose which statue to put up. But again, you see the use of statues, same period, second half of the 19th century, and how political they become. This is the best known statue. It's in the Place des Pyramides, which is, I want to sort of give you a sense of the placement. What you're looking at is the Tuileries, and if you look behind, you can just see the Eiffel Tower. And it's very close to the Louvre, so you're really very centrally located. I also, when I went to work in the police archives, one of the things I did with my Sundays, because the archives aren't open, was I went to the sites of the statues, because I wanted to see what the public space looked like where all of these parades and protests were taking place. So it's a pretty good sized space, and I'll show you at the end, it's still used as a political place in Paris. In the second half of the 9th century, they put up two other important statues of Joan. One is at the Église Saint-Augustin, and if you're in terms of Paris, sorry, Don. this is just a sort of rough idea. If this is very sort of central in terms of the first statue, this one is here, and then the third is, I should put it lower, is down here in the 13th, right? If you know your arrondissement, this is the 1st, the 9th, and the 13th. And what happens in the second half of the 19th century is that the radical right, so not the left, but the nationalists on the right who are actually pro-monarchy and want a return to the monarchy, begin using Joan as a symbol, and they march from place to place. All right? And as they march, they sing songs, some of them anti-Semitic, because that's part of the ideology for the far right at this point. They yell sort of nasty slurs when they pass things like synagogues. They cheer when they pass right-wing newspapers, right? So there's a sort of whole pattern to this. So looking at all of this got me interested in the two figures. Now I'll just show you one other image, just to show you in terms of the way these statues have a life outside of the public space itself. This is a cartoon from the 1930s, all right? And so it shows the Joan of Arc who you've just seen in gold, right? And this child is asking about who burned Joan, right? And because it's another moment of serious political conflict, he thinks it is the left, the political left, that has burned Joan. And he's asking his mom if that's right. All right, so you'll see a couple other things I show you. Statues come back as sort of having a life of their own. Okay, so all of these things got me into the project, made me decide that there was something there to be studied. And when I thought about all of this material, and it's sort of over time because I was trying to do other things at the same time, first I was struck by how contentious this was, right? That there was so much vitality around these symbols. I was also struck by the interest of the police, that the French police, especially in the 19th century, keep very good track of what is happening in public space. And that includes the streets, it includes places like cafes. So you get a lot of reports that you can use about what is happening, and I'll show you what that means as I go along. I was also really impressed by how, where I thought national icons, the figures this big would be sacred or hallowed and mainly controlled by either the state or some official group, I was really struck by how they were taken over by average people, right? Now, sometimes that was a political organization, like a labor group, but sometimes it's about individuals. So one of the things police would do, because they were worried about all of this, is they would position police officers at these statues, sometimes for 24 hours a day, depending on how heated the political sphere was. And the police would note every single person who came to visit, right? So if someone came to visit Joan of Arc and brought, in particular, a wreath or left something behind, the police would note who it was, what age, male, female. They would write down what the wreath said, because people would leave wreaths with messages, and all of that would get reported back to headquarters. So it struck me that the police, the state, was so interested meant something. The other thing that I didn't expect was that it would involve so many different issues if I took this particular question up.